For our next discussion this morning, we're going to take a look at this wave of book bans and other legislation impacting the freedom to read through a political lens. And I'll be frank, this is not an easy conversation for many in the library community. The library community, of course, has long prided itself on serving the entire community in a nonpartisan way. But this is a necessary conversation. The freedom to read is a fundamental, cherished right, no matter which side of the political spectrum you're on. Public libraries and public schools are bedrock institutions. But as our previous panel suggested, it is clear that there is an element on the right today that under the guise of parental rights has chosen to politicize librarians and teachers in an unprecedented fashion. So for this conversation, we've brought together three politically active and politically savvy advocates who can speak directly to the issues. Please welcome John Kraska. John is the executive director and founder of Every Library, the only national political action committee for libraries. John and the Every Library team work each election season and really year-round to support local ballot initiatives in communities across the nation. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
Donald Cohen is the founder and executive director of In the Public Interest, a national nonprofit research and policy organization that studies public goods and services. And he is the co-author of The Privatization of Everything, How the Plunder of Public Goods Transformed America and How We Can Fight Back. Welcome, Donald.
Thanks for having me.
And Caroline Richmond is, of course, the award-winning author of numerous books and the executive director of We Need Diverse Books, a terrific nonprofit organization that advocates for diversity in children's literature. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you.
So, John, I want to start with you because you said something to me last fall when we were talking about this issue, just as we were really beginning to understand the scope and the sort of the organized nature of these challenges. And what you said really resonated. You said that, that old playbook of issuing outrage statements, well, that just wasn't going to get the job done this time. So to get us started, because you're so good at this, I'm going to ask you to sort of give it to us straight. Tell us, broadly speaking, what you're seeing going on in the country right now with these book bans, about the organized political movement happening here, and what a proper defense really does look like.
Andrew, thanks for convening this conversation and for the opportunity to chat about this. It's a very interesting moment in time where individual school libraries, individual public libraries are being subjected to a tremendous number of book bans that are coming from several different vectors, very few of which look like true concerns. They are highly politicized, very performative, and some of them are rather weaponized. At the same time, we're seeing initiatives at the state level that are doing several things that are not about a particular title or groups of titles, but are affecting really the structure of government when it comes to public libraries, the dignity of work in libraries as well, the structure of education, the role that school libraries have both in curriculum support as well as individual discovery, the vectors that are in play here. I sometimes think about the First Amendment as being both our true friend and our most difficult ally, because within the First Amendment, there's conflict. There are 5 freedoms in the First Amendment. Of course, freedom of speech, which leads to the freedom of access, the freedom to learn, the freedom to read. But there's also the right to petition the government. There's freedom of assembly. There's freedom of religion as well. And there's an issue with the religiosity of some of these attacks on individual books, as well as some of the legislative structures that are happening. And then, of course, transparency issues around the freedom of the press. The 5 freedoms internally are in conflict. And I think that the side that's advancing the book bans and some of this onerous legislation understands that, knows it, leans into it, and therefore gums up the works with it. When we see a book banning situation that is based on, I'm going to use a very loaded word, a legitimate concern that a parent has about a book for their kids, whether it's in a public library or a school library, we see policies that are in place to protect that parent and their needs and opinions. We see policies that are in place that are followed that protect the community in general and the integrity of the library, whether it's a public library or a school library. When we see them instead weaponized, politicized, highly performative, policies are either being ignored or railroaded. Policies are being abrogated, and it's intended to break down the structure of our society. It's an attack vector also on the individuals, the people that are represented by those books. the three vectors really for school library attacks are in some ways anti-intellectual, anti-education. What's the value of education if the whole system is gummed up with these kinds of challenges? It's anti-public funding for the public education space. Folks who are looking to have money follow the kids, whether it's privatization, vouchers, other ways to move public money out of schools, are really interested in these book bans and these kinds of legislative attacks, as well as anti-professional. And we see some of the legislative initiatives and the accusations against librarians as being somehow pornographers, as being somehow involved in peddling obscenity or smut and putting children in danger as a component of the anti-professionalism that's going on. And on the public library side, it's very similar. Except that it's an attack on the structure of government. Andrew, it's a heck of a time to be involved in libraries, because while we can count up and report dozens, hundreds, thousands of individual book challenges, it's the systems of our libraries, our government, and our educational environment that are under attack, and at least in our opinion.
Well said, well explained. Caroline, you devoted a significant chunk of your professional life to getting diverse books for kids on school and library shelves. But in some communities now, the kind of performative actions that John is talking about is sort of trying to recast, your efforts, basically the efforts of anyone trying to get diverse books out is, wokeness, basically. One Idaho state representative recently called it indoctrination. But talk about your work and talk about doing your work in this climate. How do you counter that political charge now of wokeness?
Sure. I'd be happy to chat about a few of the things that we've been working on. We've been really alarmed by the book bans happening nationwide and how quickly they're gaining momentum, especially because many of the books in question feature diverse characters and are written by diverse authors. And it's hitting close to home. A few months back, a teacher in Iowa taught a short story to her class that was from one of our young adult anthologies called Fresh Ink. And that short story featured a teen trans swimmer and was challenged in the district. And ultimately, that teacher had to resign from her position. So in response to that, we gave away 1,000 copies of that anthology, Fresh Ink. We're also working on new initiatives to help, support librarians and teachers in this current climate. Recently, we introduced a new initiative called the Educators Making a Difference Grant, which provides $2,000 for educators to incorporate diverse books into their schools or libraries. We chose 35 grant recipients located all around the country, and these educators are doing some really exciting things with that money. For instance, there's a teacher in California who's using the funds to broaden their selection of LGBTQIA+ books, because as recently as 2019, their library did not have a single title with LGBTQIA+ representation. There's also a librarian in Idaho who will use the grant money to buy diverse books to give away at their summer reading events. Since their community is predominantly white, they are prioritizing books by Black authors to share with their patrons. And just a couple weeks ago, we teamed up with a coalition of authors to launch the Support LGBTQIA+ Youth campaign. We're providing book care packages to LGBTQIA+ kids and teens who live in states affected by anti-LGBTQ legislation and book bans on LGBTQIA+ books. So states like Florida, Texas, Idaho. And we're also hoping to coordinate author visits with local groups that service LGBTQIA+ youth so that they can hear from a queer author and draw inspiration from that conversation. Those are just a few initiatives that we've been working on. There's more in the works just because the book banning is only ratcheting up.
Indeed. Donald Cohen, you are a powerful advocate for public institutions, and you've written about the encroachment of privatization in the public sphere. So first off, I want to get you to respond, to talk for your take, as John did, about what's going on here. But also, I wonder, too, if part of what's making this wave of book bans and educational gag orders possible is that so many people today have been trained or inclined now to be suspicious of public institutions, right? And maybe even trained to think of them more like their customers than citizens in a community. So, what's your take on all of this? And, your perspective would be very useful here.
So I think, it's not just that people have been trained. There's been a somewhat of a 40-year plus assault on both the idea and the institution of government. And I think that's really important to understand. There are folk, and that comes from different places. It comes from people who, there are true believers, people who really believe, in a very small government. It also comes from political folks. I'll give you a couple of quotes. I mean, many of us know about Grover Norquist's quote, the conservative strategist. He says, "I'm not in favor of abolishing government. I just want to shrink it down to the size where I can drown it in a bathtub." And he's a political guy. He wants to, he wants smaller government for lots of reasons. But there are also people like Milton Friedman that, this is around public education. So the quote that I want to give you, it says, and he said this not in the 50s in the 50s, he came up with the idea of school vouchers. But he said this, about 20 years ago. He said, "In my ideal world, government would not be responsible for providing education any more than it is for providing food and clothing." So they have a different idea. And so if you put those forces together, a political force and an ideological force, their intent is to turn people away from the idea of government, the idea that there are things we have to do together, and the institution itself. So the book banning is really about weaponizing those different ideas. And I think really important to say right at the center of it, racism now is spoken out loud in the country. It's not never gone away, but it's spoken out loud, and this is clearly part of the use of race and racism to turn people away from the institutions of government. The last thing I'll say is the public education system itself is under amazing assault right now. And one of the things the book bans and the anti-masking, you can put all that together, is it wants to get people to leave public schools and go to private schools and go to vouchers and go to charter schools because they literally want to dismantle the public education system. So it's sort of part of a whole, assault on, like I've said, on both the idea and the institutions.
So now I'm going to ask you all to put on your advocate hats, your political advocate hats, to message well. To win a political issue, you have to message well. And, the message from those seeking to ban books has been pretty seductive to a lot of Americans who've been fed a steady diet of outrage, right? It's parental control. There's pornography in your library. Your kids are being groomed. And that's reaching an alarming number of people, I think, and it's hitting the mark. So what's the message that effectively counters that? And how do we get that message out? Donald, I'll start with you.
So, it's obviously, this is the tough part because, lies seem to have legs, they have salience. So the first thing for us to understand is that debunking allows us to say their idea again. To say, well, you're not true. So we have to debunk because it's simply false. But if that's all we're doing, we're kind of in trouble. I think it's really important to basically lift up the idea that we need to learn about history. We need to learn about different people. We need to learn about different perspectives. I think if you think about what's going on in America today, all the divisions, and I think a lot promulgated by these forces, we have a massive empathy deficit in this country. People just don't understand each other. And because they're not interacting. And when we don't interact, when increasing segregation of our public schools and our public spaces, when people are not interacting, they don't understand each other. And if they don't understand each other, they don't have appreciation for different perspectives. So I think this is my personal belief. I'm just not poll tested or anything. That is, we need to lift up the idea that we need to understand everybody. And part of the reason we need to understand everybody and lots of things is because we're tied together. Whether we believe it or not, we are interdependent on one another. COVID taught us that. Education system teaches that. All of our public systems teach us that.
Well said. Caroline, I'm going to throw the same thing to you. What's the effective message to counter this sort of parental guidance narrative that's being tossed around out there?
I really love what Donald said, and the message I would share is one that WNDB has been using since we got our start. And it's that we believe reading teaches empathy, that a book can open a child's heart by showing them how to walk in another person's shoes. And as parents, as members of our communities, shouldn't we want our future generations to grow into caring and compassionate adults? And books are free if you have access to your local library. So that's a message I would use.
Powerful message. John.
Andrew, when did you stop beating your dog? You know, I mean, the allegations that, as Donald identified, are back in 2018, there was a lawsuit brought by the Thomas More Society against EBSCO, the database company, and the Colorado Library Consortium, CLIC, alleging that there was pornography and obscenity in the EBSCO databases. By extension, Gale, ProQuest, everybody else was lumped in on that. And during the discovery phase of the lawsuit, the judge dismissed the lawsuit with prejudice because the allegations were completely unfounded, completely off base, unreplicable, and that didn't stop them. Because it's not a situation where they were actually able to prove, it's the activity of alleging. And the empathy gap that both of my colleagues here have identified, and the active nature, the psychoactive nature of the books, I mean, the books are powerful. Our friend and colleague Emily Knox at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign talks about this in her research and work. The books are being targeted because they're power-filled, and they are psychoactive, and they move hearts and minds. They inhabit you as a reader, and part of the politics of division is to ensure that there are continued divisions. So there's 2 or 3 ways to come against a situation like this. One of them is to talk about more than the First Amendment, about why we're in library work. The First Amendment's important, but so is the 14th Amendment when it comes to due process and civil rights. So is the local ordinance or the state laws that set up education and public libraries. Why are we doing this work as library professionals? Why are we aligned around individual discovery, community growth, student success? Folks haven't heard that story from us in a long time. And it's not just because of COVID. Before COVID, we saw in OCLC and the From Awareness to Funding survey that they did in 2018 that the image of librarianship had dropped from 2008 when they did the first survey to 2018 by a tremendous number of basis points on a couple of key issues around the visibility of librarianship. So a second way to address this is not only about the institution, but about the individuals who have the skill set, the wisdom, the empathy to do collection development in public library and school library settings, and to defend the librarians. And the first group of folks that have to defend us is us as well. And I think that the third way is to not only name our value system around public education and public institutions, our hopes around having librarians in the mix, but the third way forward is to make sure that it's not the library community by itself, because by itself, we are a special interest group. This is a general interest for America. If we're not showing up with the public sector side that Donald is talking about and the diversity community that Caroline is talking about, if we're not showing up to listen as well as lead, we're not going to succeed in this conversation, because it's going to be a bunch of people saying, "Oh, look at the books we have on our shelf," and Banned Books Week is going to be a problem instead of a celebration.
Well, that is a really good point, and it leads me right into my next question, which is, a recent poll found that 70% of respondents are opposed to removing books from libraries and schools. The poll was done by the American Library Association. So it's like, there's a small minority of people, it seems like, who are very vocal and very activated that are driving these book bans, right? Small but vocal. As the old adage says, decisions are made by those who show up. So is that really the message we have to get out here? You got to show up, right? You have to show up to your school board or your local board meeting. You have to vote. More important, you have to run for office, right? Volunteer, get involved. Caroline, is that where we need to go with this?
Yes, to everything you mentioned. This is a very local issue, so we need to engage people on the local level. We need folks to show up and speak out at the polls, at school board meetings, in their community newspapers, online. And yes, if possible, we'd love for advocates of diverse books, of all books, to run for office themselves. We've started a blog series that charts these sort of things of how you can get involved at the local level. But for those who maybe aren't able to do as much of an active role, we'd also ask them to keep an eye out in your communities. We started a soft censorship intake form to basically chart what books are getting soft censored and where it's happening. This is something that's really concerning to us because we know about the book bans, right? Those tend to attract more attention, but there are also books that are getting soft censored, meaning they are getting quietly pulled off the shelves, or they're not getting purchased at all. So this forum is a way for people to let us know what's going on locally, anonymously, if so desired, so we can keep a track of what books are getting censored and where it's happening.
That is a really good point. The soft censorship issue came up in a previous panel that we did. Obviously, so many librarians are feeling intimidated by their boards, right? They're like, maybe I won't buy that book because I'm going to get in trouble for it. Mm-hmm. That's a terrible situation to be in. John, I'm guessing you have some thoughts on getting people involved.
Well, there are three ways that people put their hope to work, their concerns to work. And it's either their good name, their money, or their time. And every library as an organization is looking to help move those folks forward across those three different potential budgets that they have to spend. But the particulars in any community are going to be different from community to community. If you have an opportunity to name the source of the problem, either as a watchdog in your community, talking about how boards are supposed to be conducting things, how policy is supposed to be followed, how civil society and education is supposed to be organized, you should stand up as a watchdog. If you have an opportunity in your local community to be a guard dog for the integrity of librarianship and the role of libraries in our education settings, in our communities, be the guard dog. And if you are looking for direction, groups like Every Library on our action.everylibrary.org platform, the things that We Need Diverse Books are doing, some of our other colleagues across different censorship coalitions are doing. If you're like, I'm not exactly sure what to do, the bird dogs out there will help you figure that out.
Donald.
So I'll say a couple of things. So one is that, kind of going off what John said a little earlier, is that if you think about a library, I'm not a librarian. I'm a user of libraries. I go to my library regularly. It's a few blocks from my house, and most people connect with their It's one of the few places that we can go that's a public institution where we like going, and we like talking to the people behind the desk, and they help our kids do homework, or they help me look for a book on an issue I'm trying to look for. So I think there is to your question about there's goodwill out there, and I think we need to not just defend librarians but exalt librarians. And there's and librarians need to play a huge role in that, of just greater awareness of the things that you do and the kids that you help and the community programs that you do. I think that's kind of an always thing, and it can't be done enough. So that's the first thing I think is really important. The second thing, and just in terms of activism, in addition to all the other stuff, is I wonder if, because young people aren't taking it, I don't think. And, the next generation that are, in schools and high schools and things. So if I was a high school student right now in a place that was banning books, I would do a read-in outside my library or my school. I would engage the young people to say, we just want to learn. And I think there could be a lot of energy to do that.
That is a really good point. And I think we've seen that, have we not? That in communities where these sort of book bans and educational gag orders have gone in place, that the students have done a good job of fighting back and showing their resistance, and it's been effective. Another potential avenue here, there was a lawsuit filed in federal court over some of the restrictions placed on the Lino County Library there, seeking to reverse what the county commissioners had done, including, basically closing off the library, replacing the library board with political appointees, and then closing off access to board meetings. But I wonder, can the courts really be an effective tool in this fight? Is it political? Are the courts, which are also being attacked as an institution, the way that we get through this? What can we expect from the courts here? Donald, I'll start with you.
Well, I am not a lawyer either, and looking at the ultimate court, the Supreme Court this week, doesn't give me hope that free speech and free right and individual rights and greater knowledge are core to the judicial system at that level. So I think so. I don't want to weigh in to say whether there's an issue, whether we can do that or not. But I do worry about it.
John, lawsuits are expensive, and the wheels of justice can grind slowly. But are they part of the fight here?
Yes, and it's broader than just First Amendment issues. Here at Every Library and the Every Library Institute, our nonprofit side, we're starting to pull together some more strategic resources around legal defense. State courts matter a great deal when you're looking at the way that government is structured and education policy is realized. And then again, it's not just the First Amendment; it's 14th Amendment and due process. There needs to be a willing plaintiff, though, and in many of the local library issues that we're dealing with, it's not just the guard dog, watchdog, and bird dog stuff around organizing local communities to fight for what they believe in. It's also potentially identifying a willing and capable plaintiff who has standing. And to anyone listening to this today, if you're involved in a fight, it is just as important to find an ally with legal representation as it is to find somebody who has. And this is not a judgment call, but it takes a lot of courage to show up, and that takes a lot of encouragement. We want to be there for those folks as that progresses, because sometimes the only recourse is to the courts. We had one situation in Mississippi recently, back in February, when the mayor of that town decided to cut off all the public library funding in Ridgeland, Mississippi, because he wanted to see all the homosexual materials removed from the library. And that was both a funding challenge, but also a real problem about how civil rights and how duty of care for an elected official, those intersection points are not uncomplicated. And while there was a political remedy in that kind of a context, there could have also been one through the courts.
Yeah. Caroline, you do such great work getting diverse books into communities on the shelves. I would like to see all of your money go to providing diverse books and grants for that thing. But, is some of that money going to have to go to the lawyers? You're going to be writing amicus briefs in the future?
As Donald said, I am not a lawyer. The legal world is not my wheelhouse. But as I was listening to Donald and John talking, it made me think about how we were talking about empowering voters, getting people to run for local school boards. Maybe that needs to be expanded to running for city councils, mayoral seats, or maybe just letting people know about the judges that are running in their counties. I know oftentimes those are some of the elections that I have a really hard time finding out about who's running and who should I vote for. And these are the people who might be making decisions that really affect what's getting taught in our schools, how our schools and libraries are getting funded. So maybe that is a way we can help push this forward.
And Caroline, if I can jump in and see if you want to be a part of this organizationally, Every Library is going to be working on candidate surveys for state legislators and for local school board races. In some communities, it's difficult to find every single school board race around the country. But we're going to be doing some systemic work to talk to state legislators, candidates for office, as well as candidates for school board over the next 2 or 3 fiscal years. We've done some pilot programs in places like New Jersey and Pennsylvania in order to ask key questions about what do those candidates believe about things like freedom of access and the structure of education, the role of librarians, both in communities and on campuses. So we're hitting the nail on the head there in terms of understanding the ways that elected officials believe. But then it's the strident engagement, as you both know, as we all know on this call, moving forward that keeps bad policies from advancing.
And John, one thought, for candidate questionnaires, there probably are many organizations in community. There are many organizations in communities that aren't necessarily library focused that do candidate endorsements and have candidate questionnaires. So it can, you could probably find all sorts of alliances in the communities you're working to just add that one question, so they see it. Candidates should know that we all want the truth and we all want knowledge.
I'm with you on that, Donald. And there's some places that are a little bit further along in the big tent around civil society and education than others. And yeah, you're a pro at this, man.
Yeah. I'd love to chat. I mean, I think just as a private citizen, it would be so useful to have a place to go and check out what people's stances are, in one place, instead of having to comb through your local paper or doing Google searches and just coming up empty.
That's right.
To close, I just would like to get sort of a parting message from everyone here. What has you most concerned? What are you perhaps optimistic about? For me personally, this is the number one issue I think facing us as a community right now, librarians and schools. Like, this is fundamental. Publishers, writers, authors, all of us, citizens. What are you thinking? So I guess, Caroline, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, to end on a hopefully more positive note, I wanted to share what gives me optimism, which are librarians and teachers themselves. For all of you out there who are advocating for your students and patrons and who are oftentimes working in hostile environments. As I mentioned previously, we recently launched our Educators Making a Difference grant. We received nearly 600 applications, and I was the one who did the initial read through of all of them. And there were a few times I had to stop because I was tearing up. Not only because I was feeling overwhelmed by the need out there, but mostly because I was touched by the passion that I read in these applicants' words. You could really feel their dedication, how they spoke about their students and patrons, how hard they are fighting to find resources for their kids. And I know that many of the applicants were spending their precious hours outside of work to apply for this grant so that their kids could have more. So to the librarians and teachers watching, thank you for the work you're doing. I know that many of you are tired and frustrated, but I want you to know that we see you and we recognize you. We thank you for fighting, and we are going to do whatever we can to keep fighting alongside you.
Donald, parting thoughts.
Well, first, Caroline, sign me up. Yeah, I'd say a similar thing. I mean, in my view, librarians are, heroes, and teachers are heroes. They're people who go to work every day to help somebody learn. In my work, I speak to a lot of people who work for government of different kind, all kinds of state government, local government, and just workers, public sector employees. And I find, they're all feel under attack. They all are under attack at some level. But when you ask them what they do on their job, they're pretty, they do cool stuff and they're proud of it. And so I urge over and over again, kind of like I said earlier, let people know what you do. Not just I'm a librarian, I teach, but I'm a librarian and there was this kid that I helped the other day, So I think the most important thing we can do is lift up the idea of expanding knowledge that you do, to lift up how you do it every day. What you're doing is you're teaching kids how to learn. You're teaching us all, because not just kids go in libraries. You're teaching us how to learn. You're teaching us how to think. You're teaching us how to ask questions, and you're teaching us how to understand things that we don't come across every day in our daily life. There's nothing more important.
Well said. John, I'm going to give you the last word on this. And I just want to say to our audience out there that you've been doing tremendous work. I've seen you on a couple of panels talking about this subject. You did some great stuff at every library, so thank you for that. And I'm interested to hear your final thoughts today on this.
My heart goes out to every single librarian in a public library or school setting that's facing a book ban or a challenge. The way that you have to deal with that with integrity, to focus on policy, to talk about why the book is in the collection or why it supports the curriculum. All of those are very, very onerous. They're difficult, they're laborious, they're burdensome. And I'm going to ask for a favor, which is to not get distracted with the individual school level or public library level book bans and challenges, because the fight is starting to move into the state legislatures. In fact, it's already there. and the individual book challenges, even the collective book challenges, while extremely important, the permanent changes to the infrastructure of government and the infrastructure of education are extremely concerning. It's issues around decertifying librarianship. It's criminalizing library work. It is onerous terms and conditions for sales. I mean, folks, not to discount anything that my colleagues here have said earlier about the salutary nature of things, but 2023, the legislature that's going to be in place after the midterms in Congress and after the state legislative elections, 2023, folks, is what I'm really preparing for over the summer of 2022.
Really good points. John Kraska, Caroline Richmond, Donald Cohen, thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you for having us.
Real pleasure. Thank you, Andrew.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you.